Hey Bio20s, just getting a quick workout in before we go through our lesson today. I'm back again for another one, and we are talking about muscles. We're going to talk about the different types of muscles, and we're also going to talk about how muscle fibers help you move. So we're going to begin with the different types of muscles. So there's 3 different types of muscles you're going to find in your body. The first type is called cardiac muscle, and as the name suggests, you're going to find it in your heart. So your heart is made of very special muscle. It beats involuntary, meaning you don't have to think about using it, and you'll only find cardiac muscle in the heart. Now, you can influence your heart rate with your autonomic nervous system, your nervous system that is automatic. So in situations where you might need to increase your heart rate or decrease your heart rate, that can also play a role. But in a sense, cardiac muscle is able to beat on its own, makes up the heart, and that is the only place that you'll find the cardiac muscle. The next type of muscle is smooth muscle. So whereas cardiac muscle, they have some stripes, some striations to it. Skeletal muscle, very stripy, very striated. Smooth muscle, as the name suggests, looks very smooth. No stripes, no striations, and we find the smooth muscle in your inner organ systems. This would be like your esophagus, your intestines, your stomach. So if you remember from the digestive system, when we talked about how food gets pushed down your esophagus involuntarily through peristalsis, that's with the smooth muscle of your esophagus contracting and then pushing that food down. And then finally, what we're going to focus most of today's lesson on is the skeletal muscles. These would be the muscles, like when you think of muscles, you would think of biceps, triceps, quads, glutes, etc. These would be skeletal muscles. Essentially, they are muscles attached to bones by tendons. Now, people often get tendons and ligaments confused. A tendon is a connective tissue that essentially attaches a muscle to a bone. So for example, your muscle will be attached to the bone with a certain tendon. A ligament is a tissue that's found between joints, so it attaches bone to bone. So you can think ligament, bone to bone, tendon, muscle to bone. Now, skeletal muscles, they are striped, they are striated, they allow us to move, and when they contract, they actually release a lot of heat. So 80% of energy used in a muscle contraction is lost as heat, which is one reason why we actually end up shivering when we're cold. So when our body temperature drops, our muscles start vibrating involuntarily to generate heat and try and warm us up a little bit. But essentially, a skeletal muscle, their main function is to move. So it is to move your body, move your skeleton, and do all the different things that we do. Now, when it comes to skeletal muscles, we can talk about muscles in terms of pairs. Like oftentimes muscles are found as a pair. We call them antagonistic muscles. So for example, the bicep and the tricep would be opposites. When the bicep contracts, the tricep relaxes. When the tricep contracts, the bicep relaxes. Now, if we go even deeper into the muscle, so we take a muscle tissue or a muscle, we'll say muscle, we'll say like any muscle, right? We'll say any muscle in the body, we'll say a quad, right? So you go into your quad muscle. If you go super, super deep into that muscle, you're gonna find muscle fibers. So muscle fibers make up the muscle tissue. If you go even deeper there, you're gonna find these fibers enclosed in a membrane called a sarcolemma. And then if you go even further, you're gonna find these 2 myofilaments. So they're really, really tiny filaments. They're called actin and myosin. And these are the 2 things that make your muscles move. The actin is the thinner myofilament, whereas the myosin is the thicker and has kind of like a club-shaped head on it. So if we take a look here, here's our muscle. So this is a big skeletal muscle, right? If you took it, it's a big, big muscle. And then if you look inside of it, you have these bundles, right? These are all big bundles, kind of like a bundle of hay, right? Or I don't know, if you take a bunch of pencils and put an elastic around them, you got a bundle of pencils. If you take one bundle out, so I'm gonna take one bundle out, and then I'm gonna take one bundle of that out, we have what's called a sarcolemma. And then inside of a sarcolemma, we have the 2 myofilaments, which would be your actin and myosin. Okay, so this here is called the sliding filament model, and this is where things get a little bit tricky. The easiest way to explain this is a muscle contraction involves the connection of actin and myosin. So you'll see in this little animation here, the myosin, these are the pink heads, they are attaching to the actin. The actin is this piece right here. Now, It's not as simple as just actin and myosin coming together. There's a few moving pieces here. So first off, if we look at one sarcomere, a sarcomere will be divided by these things called Z lines because they look like the letter Z. One sarcomere goes Z line to Z line, okay? And then inside of a sarcomere, we're gonna have the myosin. This would be the thicker filament with the little clubs on them. And then we're gonna have the actin. And the actin is actually attached directly to the Z lines. So the actin is attached to the Z lines, myosin is not. The space between the actin molecules we call the H zone. So the H zone is going to change depending on how we do our muscle contraction. So we may end up contracting or relaxing, and that's going to change the space within the H zone. So I want to explain this part here a little bit more. What happens is we first need to get our actin ready for an attachment, then we need to make an attachment, and then we need to pull, and then we need to detach. So it's kind of like a 4-step process here to move your muscles. Now keep in mind, when you activate a muscle, you are activating all, ideally, these little fibers inside of that muscle to make it move. So what we're going to need to do is we are going to need to get the myosin to attach to the actin. Off the bat though, myosin can't do that because there's these two molecules in place. I like to call them like bodyguard molecules. There is your troponin, these little red ones here, and then these bands, these little ropes, it's called tropomyosin. They essentially will block the myosin and the actin from joining together. So what we need to do is get those bodyguards out of the way. And how we do that is we actually bring in calcium. These little ions here, this says Ca+, those are calcium ions. So you actually need calcium to move a muscle. So to kind of make things a little simpler, when you want to move a muscle, a nerve signal gets sent to that muscle and it basically floods the sarcolemma, the sarcomere, with calcium. Calcium binds to the troponin, the actins, you can see here it's going to bind to the troponin. Okay, there's the calcium binding to the troponin. It's going to move the actin, and when it moves the actin, this rope gets moved as well, and it's basically an open binding site now. Then myosin is going to go up, attach to the actin, pull, so it's like kind of like rowing a boat, it's like a working stroke, and then detach. When you contract, the space here, the H zone, is going to get smaller. When you relax, it's going to get larger. And then sometimes the fibers will actually overlap one another, and that's where we get the striation we see in our muscles. Okay, so like I said, it's kind of a 4-step process here to move your myofilaments. So step number 1, we need to get the troponin and the tropomyosin out of the way. So that's going to be your calcium coming in, moving those little bodyguard molecules, giving you a nice binding site. You'll notice here that on the head of the myosin, there is a ADP and a phosphate. This is the low battery form of ATP, so it's a low battery form. The head will go up and attach. So the myosin goes up and attaches. It will then pull, that's a working stroke, so it's going to pull, and then on the other side it's going to pull as well, so they get closer together, that's a contraction, and it's going to kick off the ADP and the phosphate. Now, this is the interesting piece. Most people think that you need energy to move your muscle, which is true, right? I'm not going to say it's not true. But actually, you need the energy to detach the myosin from the actin. So what happens is, a fresh molecule of ATP comes in, it causes the myosin to detach, and then we're going to go back to where we were. So then the actin goes back. When you then detach, right, when you detach, that ATP turns into ADP and phosphate again. So really, if you kind of tie everything together here, we use the glucose for cell respiration to make ATP, then the ATP goes into our cells, like our muscles, and it's used to detach the myosin from the actin. Have you ever heard of a term called rigor mortis before? It's when someone passes away and their body goes stiff. It's because they still have calcium in their body, but they don't have ATP anymore. So they can still attach the actin to the myosin, but they can't detach it anymore. So that's essentially how a muscle contraction functions. We get the actin ready, we attach the myosin, we detach with some ATP, and then we get ready for another contraction. Now, there may be a pause between the impulse and the contraction, right? You might have a brief period, that's called the latent period. And after the contraction occurs, there's a brief relaxation period. That being said though, if you are in a state of constant muscle contraction, this would be like, if you're moving a couch, you pick up the couch and your muscles are contracted because you gotta lift that couch. That's a state what we call tetanus, where your muscles are fully contracted. They're not relaxing, contracted, and then you drop the couch and then they're relaxed. So it'll look something like this. We're gonna take our stimulus. So the stimulus will occur here. So there'll be some type of stimulus like your nervous system saying, hey, move your muscle. That will cause a muscle contraction. So there's a brief pause between very brief, like we're talking milliseconds of the nervous system saying, hey, muscle move, and then the muscles start moving. Then we get a full muscle contraction, right? We get a full muscle contraction, and then we go through the relaxation phase where we're going to relax, okay? Depending on the size of the contraction, right? We can have small muscle contractions, big muscle contractions. We can get multiple muscles involved. And this is why, if you're doing any type of fitness, working out, the most difficult movements you can do sometimes are those complex movements, like say your deadlift or your squat or your snatch or things like that, because you're incorporating multiple muscle groups at the very same time, getting that nervous system to fire, get all those muscles to work at the very same time in a way that lets you perform the move safely and efficiently. Okay, and then this is what a stimulus looks like normally. So contraction, relax, contraction, relax, contraction, relax. This one we're seeing contraction, but not a full relaxation. So there's not a full relaxation in there until here. And then this one down here, we see contraction, hold, and then a relaxation. Okay, and then finally, there are different types of muscle fibers, so they're not all the same. There's really 3 types, but 2 of them are very similar. So I like to think of them as 2 types. There's type 1 and type 2. And it really just determines the speed at which the muscle fiber can fire. A type 1 muscle fiber is more so like if you were a long distance marathon runner, if you wanted to do things where endurance is key. These types of muscle fibers are not as quick to get the ATP, but they're much more efficient, so they'll last longer. Whereas a fast twitch muscle fiber, like your 2A or your 2X, they're more so for the burst, right? Your sprinting, your burst of speed when you're, running or playing hockey or things like that. So the average person, the average active person would probably have a good mix of both, right? Because you're doing a lot of different things. You're probably gonna have some slow and some fast. If you are a person who's like a world-class sprinter, right? Like you are just like top, explosive athlete, your thing is short distances, you're gonna be training those fast twitch muscle fibers far more than your slow twitch muscle fibers. So your muscle fibers are gonna be more with the use the energy as quickly as possible, but it's not as efficient. Versus someone who's more of a distance runner, marathon runner, endurance athlete, these types of people would have far more slow twitch muscle fibers to allow them to use that energy for longer periods of time and more effectively. Okay, so then next video, we're gonna get into the excretory system, where we're gonna talk about the parts of the excretory system, the parts of the kidney, the nephron, and then ultimately how we get rid of waste through urine formation. So thanks again for watching, and we'll chat soon.